In this video, I'm going to do some mass-to-mass conversion practice when given a balanced equation. So we're continuing on our stoichiometry journey, and I will be doing numbers 1 and number 4 from the mass-to-mass conversion practice worksheet. So number 1 says how many moles of oxygen will be produced from 198.2 grams of silver oxide. So the first thing we need to do is balance this equation. Hopefully, there was a little mishap with the conversion of the document. So that should be an arrow. Make sure that's an arrow on your paper. Hopefully you know how to balance equations. You find it pretty easy. I'm going to start by balancing my oxygens. There are 2 on my product side, so I need 2 on my reactant side. Well, that makes my silver 4. So I need 4 on my product side, and now everything is balanced. So I am looking for moles of oxygen. So I'm looking for moles of oxygen produced from grams of silver oxide when I'm given grams of silver oxide. So my path needs to start with my grams of silver oxide, and I will be converting it into, the only thing I can convert grams of something into is moles of itself, so moles of silver oxide. And then once I have moles of silver oxide, I can use that mole ratio to convert into moles of oxygen, which is what I want. I know in the previous video we then went one step further to convert into grams of oxygen, but in this case I'm just asked for moles of oxygen, so I just need to stop at moles. I don't need to go one step further. So just a reminder, to convert from grams of silver oxide into moles of silver oxide, so between grams and moles of the same thing, I'm going to be doing the molar mass of silver oxide. So go ahead and do that calculation, pause the video, and then check your answer. So after doing this calculation, you should get that 231.8 grams of silver oxide is equal to 1 mole of silver oxide. And then our next step is to convert from the moles of silver oxide into moles of oxygen. So that's when I use my mole ratio. So I know that 2 moles of silver oxide equals 1 mole of oxygen. So again, if this is blank, that means it's 1. It's really a 1 in here. So now I'm ready to set up my equation. So I always start with what I'm given, in this case 198.2 grams of silver oxide, and now I'm converting it into moles of silver oxide. That's my first step. So I have my multiplication sign and a line. Remember, this is like over 1, so my grams is in my numerator. So I want to get rid of grams of silver oxide, so I'm going to put my unit grams of silver oxide on the bottom, and as you can see from this step, I'm converting into moles of silver oxide. So when I look at these numbers, I see that if I have 1 mole of silver oxide, I would have 231.8 grams of silver oxide. So now my grams of silver oxide cancel out, and I can move on to my next step. So I'm converting from moles of silver oxide into moles of oxygen using the mole ratio. So I have my multiplication sign and a line. Since I am converting from silver oxide into oxygen, my moles of oxygen need to go on top, and my moles of silver oxide need to go on bottom. And then that's 2 moles of silver oxide for every 1 mole of oxygen. So I can fill in those numbers, and now I can multiply across by my numerators and divide by my denominator. And I'll round to 4 significant figures because that's what I'm given here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 0.4275 moles of oxygen. Now, if you feel like you got all this, but when you put it in your calculator, the right answer isn't coming out, what I would recommend is put your whole denominator in parentheses. So you can type in 198.2. Notice since these are both 1, we don't really need to multiply by them because it would still give you 198.2. So you can do 198.2 divided by parenthesis 231.8 times 2 close parenthesis. Or you can just do your numerator and write that out, and then do your denominator separately, write that out, and then do the division. So number 4 says how many grams of silver are produced if 10.3 grams of oxygen are produced. And we're using that same balanced equation. This same balanced equation will apply for this whole worksheet. We're using that same equation. So we are looking for grams of silver when 10.3 grams of oxygen are produced. So we're going from grams of oxygen into grams of silver. So our path is going to be, we're starting with grams of oxygen, and the only thing we can convert grams of something into is moles of that same thing. So, and that's by using the molar mass. So we can convert from grams of oxygen into moles of oxygen, and then we can use our mole ratio to convert from moles of oxygen into moles of silver, because that's the substance that we want. And then we can finish by converting from moles of silver into grams of silver. And so this is our path. So pause the video here and try and figure out your conversion factors and solve this problem. These are the conversion factors that we need to use to go from grams to moles of oxygen. We're going to use the red conversion factor. From the periodic table, I know that 32 grams of oxygen is equal to 1 mole of oxygen. And then from moles of oxygen to moles of silver, I'm going to use my orange conversion factor. From the balanced equation, I see that the coefficient of oxygen is blank, which means it's 1 mole of oxygen, and my coefficient for silver is 4. So 1 mole of oxygen is produced every time 4 moles of silver are produced. And then my last conversion factor is from moles of silver to grams of silver. So again, I'm going to use my molar mass of silver, and that's from the periodic table. So now we're ready to set this up. So we start with our given, 10.3 grams of oxygen. And our first step is to go from grams of oxygen to moles of oxygen. So my grams need to go on bottom because that's what I'm getting rid of. And my moles goes on top. That's what I'm trying to convert it into. And so my grams cancel out and I'm left with moles of oxygen. Then my next step is to go from moles of oxygen into moles of silver. So again, my moles of oxygen need to go on bottom now. So that way these units cancel and I'm converting into moles of silver. That's my goal right now, moles of silver. So then I look at my orange conversion factor and I see 1 mole of oxygen is equal to 4 moles of silver. And then I'm ready for my last step. And I'm converting from moles of silver to grams of silver. So moles of silver go on bottom. And this way my unit, moles of silver, cancel out. And I am converting it into grams of silver. So I know from my yellow conversion factor, 1 mole of silver is equal to 107.9 grams of silver. Sorry for that overlap. And so now again I can plug in all of my numerators and divide by my denominators. Notice there are 3 significant figures this time based on what we're given. So go ahead and plug this into your calculator and see if your answer matches mine. So hopefully that makes sense. Make sure you finish this worksheet.